Hello, I'm Jothy Rosenberg, the host of Designing Successful Startups, where today's guest is Ken Gabriel.
Money doesn't do me any good in the bank. $10 million is a hell of a lot of money.
From what I'm observing, and I'm not talking to you, even once a week, or maybe it's more like once a month, but it seems like you're having the most fun I've seen you have.
Yeah, because it allows me to focus on the things that matter and to work with people and actually bring that same perspective to them and see them all saying, yeah, I could do that.
The primary focus of our discussion with Ken revolves around the mission of BioForge, where he is CEO, which seeks to revolutionize the manufacturing processes of precision biological medicines, particularly cell and gene therapies. Ken articulates the vision of making these groundbreaking treatments more affordable and accessible, addressing the unsustainable costs that currently range from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars per treatment. We talk about Ken's grit coming from the extreme hardships his Armenian grandfather lived through, which helped make Ken extremely resilient, much as my personal trauma as a teenager began to develop my grit. Please welcome Ken to the show. Well, hello, Ken, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jothy. Great to be with you.
Thank you for making the time. I always like to start with asking people, where are they originally from and where do they live now?
Well, I grew up in the central part of PA, in York, PA, and went to undergraduate at University of Pittsburgh, where I met the love of my life. And we went off and worked at Bell Labs, in the government, twice, Boston, where most recently with Draper, where you and I met, and now we're back in Pittsburgh.
And that's the background we're seeing.
That's the background you're seeing, yes.
It's not a fake background.
It's not a fake background.
Yeah, and so speaking of that, it hasn't been that long, but you are CEO at BioForge.
Right.
And this is another in a string of very interesting things that you're taking on. And maybe you could tell us what the vision for BioForge is.
Sure. So the what of BioForge, the mission is really, I've articulated as creating breakthroughs and innovations in the manufacturing of precision biological medicines, like cell and gene therapies is an example, to speed their delivery, use, and impact. Because the promise of this individualized precision medicine is enormous. We read about it every day, whether it's a CRISPR treatment or CAR T-cell therapy treatment for cancer. But as amazing as the results are, what's even more eye-watering is the price. And much of that cost, which is for just a single treatment, anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million, is not sustainable. It's not scalable. And so BioForge is bringing that same level of creativity, energy, and drive to improve the manufacturing so that we can make it more affordable, more scalable, and available to a broader set of people. Support is coming from the R.K. Mellon Foundation. The idea is to leverage the nearly $1 billion a year in health sciences research at the University of Pittsburgh and selectively take some of the more promising developments there and accelerate the innovations and breakthroughs in manufacturing so that we don't just play the game of pachinko until somebody finally gets the manufacturing right. So it's a more direct and deliberate and specific focus on the manufacturing.
It's really in a long string of things that I would generally put into the buckets of innovation, incubation, in your career. Even your time at DARPA, you would have to put into those buckets. ATAP at Google, the way we essentially created an incubator, you and I together at Draper, which ultimately had two pretty successful spin-outs. I mean, the final answer isn't there. So what is your, philosophy about where innovation happens, what makes it happen, and where there's been real challenges about making this kind of thing work?
Yeah. So I'd say the common thread running through all that is a recognition, I think, that if we can't translate a new discovery-driven scientific research outcome into a new capability that affects people's lives or the way they do things, whether it's the internet or precision medicine, then I question what's the value of having done that work, that basic discovery-driven work. Now, I'm not minimizing that. It's important for us to add to knowledge, but I'll say my career was influenced very heavily by my 2 tours of duty at DARPA. And in particular, the very first time in the late 90s, actually early 90s. And I'll relate it in a story. I was brought in to talk to the deputy director of DARPA at the time. And he said, talk to me about MEMS, because I came to DARPA in the 90s to start the MEMS program, micro electromechanical systems. And I used the usual pitch that I used, having come from Bell Labs and sort of academic style research. And he said, tell me about MEMS. And I said, well, you can make mechanical structures using the same materials and processes as electronic materials. And he said, uh-huh. And so I realized, okay, that wasn't landing. I said,
Oh, wait, did that reaction mean he didn't believe you, or
no. He said, yeah, got it. I believe you.
so what?
So what? It was more of a so what? And I said, okay, well, because these things are on the scale of microns with submicron gaps, forces at that scale are different than the forces that dominate at our usual human scale. So for example, electrostatics is a more powerful actuating force in capacitance measurements than electromagnetics, which is what most of motors and actuators we use in our scale. And he said, yeah, again, and at this point I'm saying, okay, pull up. And I said, well, because things are so small, I can use fairly exotic, expensive materials that I couldn't afford to use at a big scale. And finally he said, yeah, but what can I do with it now that I couldn't do before? And that was like not just a light bulb, that was like an atomic bomb going off in my head that said, oh my God, he's absolutely right. Like, who cares about all this stuff if we don't create a new capability, a new way of doing things? And that's when I said, well, gee, if I could do all those things, for example, an inertial guidance system that doesn't use GPS, by the way, which is mainly a lot of the systems that Draper built for the Navy and the submarine launch ballistic missile program. That thing is the size of a Porsche and costs 10 times as a Porsche, what a Porsche costs. I could, with MEMS, potentially build a belt buckle size inertial guidance system for warfighters who might lose GPS signals for 20 minutes while they're doing various things. And he goes, now I'm interested. And so when I started, that was really crucial, because with when I was here in Pittsburgh the last time in the noughts, and started my company Acoustica making MEMS-based microphones, which I ultimately sold to Bosch, that thinking informed every one of my interactions with customers and people in the ecosystem that delivered microphones for cell phones or laptops, because I talked less about the technology, which they actually didn't care about. They didn't care whether I did it with MEMS or a slab of peanut butter, as long as that digital output microphone cost 52 cents and went down in price at 3% every quarter, right? That's what the integrators cared about. So capability is the thing that the rest of the world wants and cares about. Technology is what you developed and allows you to deliver that capability. And some of your customers may be interested in it, but what they're really interested in, what will sell it and what will make you successful, is the capability, not the technology.
The lesson that you just described is one that so many technical founders have to learn.
Absolutely.
Sometimes the hard way.
Yes.
I mean, I was guilty of it, that the famous, if we build it, they will come.
Right.
And it's, and I tried it in the book I've written, and in these discussions, I'm hoping that resonates with people that are startup founders, and they make that before it's too late, they understand this and they adapt accordingly. Staying on this topic for a moment of innovation and incubators, always had this somewhat idealistic view that there is so much money being spent to develop amazing technologies that are needed by NASA, the military, government in general. And a lot of it doesn't make it out into the commercial world. And then people occasionally make an effort to try to do something about that. I don't think any agency comes close to how good NASA is at this.
Mm-hmm.
And we tried a little bit of that, small scale. Draper was a 1,500 person company.
2,000 by the time I left.
Is a small defense contractor, a not-for-profit. And when we got together, you knew about the crash program because you were intimately involved with the creation of it as the deputy director. And I saw you in some DARPA presentations, but it wasn't until I sort of sought you out to try to find a way there being a follow-on. For the audience, Crash was what's considered a basic research program, which meant that what they wanted was
discovery-driven research.
And they didn't expect there to be things yet. And the results were good. Problem that started it was real and threatening and serious. Since there wasn't a follow-on, I was motivated to try to do something. I talked to you, you were at ATAP, then you were at Draper, and we created this concept of incubation. And I thought it was extremely well structured. And we were both kind of on the fly trying to figure out what would work best. And it didn't become a repeatable model after you left. And so that's disappointing. What you would want is, a legacy from both of us that says, here's a repeatable model. Draper could keep doing it. Other people could copy it and do it. And I want to know what your thoughts about.
There are a lot of things to touch upon in that question and story. I think, let me address the issue of Crash and DARPA's approach to programs. I think one of the things that distinguishes DARPA and the DARPA model is that you may have heard the phrase, it is a mission-driven agency. Their charter is not to advance understanding. That's a legitimate and worthy objective that NIH, NSF, a few other agencies in the federal government do. They don't have a particular objective or mission. DARPA advances science and technology. Of course they do. But it is always in service to a particular mission. And that mission, which you've heard me articulate many times, is one of the best and simplest agency objectives that I know: to create and prevent strategic surprise. That's DARPA's entire mission. Because the origins of DARPA were Sputnik. October of 1957, U.S. was surprised, with its pants down. And in February of 1958, President Eisenhower created DARPA. I'm paraphrasing, but it was like, don't let this ever happen again. And the way that DARPA doesn't make that happen is captured in the create and prevent strategic surprise. Those are two sides of the same coin. Because if you create the strategic surprise, the breakthrough, the out-of-the-box innovation, then by definition, your adversary didn't, and you are in a better position to understand it, protect yourself against it, or use it to your advantage. So the other really important defining thing is that DARPA does that and only that. It does not take on responsibility for scaling innovations. So specifically, DARPA demonstrated the ARPANET back in 1969, in the late 60s, early 70s. They demonstrated that you could create a network where the network was the network. You didn't need hub and spoke. You didn't need all that. And that was important for survivability of a communication network in the case of nuclear Armageddon, if that, forbid, ever happens, right? That once they demonstrated it, DARPA shifted it to others to scale it into what it has become, the internet, and in all its glory and bad elements as well as its good elements. The reason that's important, Jossi, is you can't do breakthroughs and out-of-the-box innovations if you are also responsible for maintaining something or scaling. Those two things are very different. And if you're going to be someone constantly pushing against the accepted standards and accepted worldview, you can't have your own worldview and some other elements of what you do. That's what I would say. Crash is not unique. There are many programs at DARPA where the basic elements, your work, other people's work in the crash program were demonstrated, but DARPA says, over to you, the rest of the world. We've got other things to explore to make sure to create and prevent strategic surprise. Now, that's where, from my perspective, one of the things I learned, both from my experience in the private sector and venture capital backed company and DARPA, was people are the most important thing. So the technology was important. The crash technology was important, but more important was you when you showed up at Draper. I bet more on you than I did on the technology. And that's also an important part of what happens, because at DARPA, people bet on program managers, not only on technology. I mean, there may be interesting technology areas, but if we can't find the right program manager, we're not going to go into that area. Howie Schroeb was an example of a great program manager that allowed us to invest in that. Now, why is that not replicatable? It takes two to tango, I think, right? You had to be there and I had to be. And by definition, that already drops the probability of it happening, because if it's you, the probability of you showing up as P, the probability of me showing up as P squared, that we're there at the same time, right? And this is something that I talk about all the time, which also is a lesson learned from DARPA obliquely. People talk about how companies should have a chief innovation officer. You hear that a lot. That goes back and forth in vogue and out of vogue. My argument is the CEO of the company is the chief innovation officer. That's part of their job. And the reason it's part of their job is the CEO is the only officer in a company that can resource, protect, and nurture a out-of-the-box breakthrough or innovation, because the rest of the company is worried about hitting their P&L targets and growing their business areas. And these people working in the breakthrough and innovation areas are the enemy. They're taking away resources. They may break my rice bowl. Our internal enemies and barriers are the biggest threat to breakthroughs and innovation. And that's why the CEO is the only person who can protect it. That's why DARPA, in its early formative stages, first 20 or 30 years, reported to the Secretary of Defense. If it hadn't reported to the CEO of the Defense Department, it would have been squashed by the much larger services and other existing laboratories and DoD research organizations. And so that's why I don't think it's as replicatable, because ultimately it depends on whether the CEO of a company or Draper or anywhere else understands how important their role is in driving innovation. A lot of CEOs think, oh, just give money to a bunch of smart people that come up with something. But if you don't give them a direction, and if you don't give them the resources and the protection, nothing will happen. You'll remember when we created Hive and you did the incubation of what ultimately spun out as Dover, I gave you the resources, I gave you the protection, but I also made it very clear what you had to demonstrate in terms of capability, not the technology, right? The technology was important. And yes, I was interested in hearing about you developing the technology. But what I needed from you to take this beyond just an interesting demonstration was, what could this development do with a new capability for cybersecurity?
Yep. Hi, the podcast you are listening to is a companion to my recent book, Tech Startup Toolkit: How to Launch Strong and Exit Big. This is the book I wish I'd had, as I was founding and running 8 startups over 35 years. I tell the unvarnished truth about what went right, and especially about what went wrong. You could get it from all the usual booksellers. I hope you like it. It's a true labor of love. Now back to the show. Do you remember when we first started, we both thought it might take 3 years, and then we both saw maybe faster progress than we had expected, and a concern that there was going to be competition. We needed to make it happen in 2 years instead of 3.
Yep.
And get out into the market. which we did.
Yeah,
We didn't give up on one bit on having a real demonstration.
that's right.
The part of the demonstration that I still laugh about is that we made it look like we were able to steal your password.
Yes, exactly. That's right. And I think this is the one of the genius elements of the DARPA approach. When you have an objective, every program has some sort of objective, some demonstration of a capability that's supported by a lot of technology and scientific development. But ultimately, everyone's working towards some sort of demonstration of a capability. When you have that as an objective, the power that a lot of people don't realize that's inherent in that kind of approach is that it helps you make choices. Because when you're developing something new, you're always uncovering interesting pathways that you could go down. I could develop this part of this. I could do this. And I don't care whether it's biology, life sciences, cybersecurity, MEMS. Gee, I could do this or I could do that. When you know you have to get there, you can make choices about which paths you're going to take. And that's what I've seen over and over again and what you just referenced, which was we thought it would take 3 years, but the clarity of an objective and the motivation and the reason that we had was we knew we could move faster because of that capability allowed us to make the decisions to not do this and double down on that.
I'll go back to the list of things that you said were your responsibility, because obviously the funding was the most important thing.
Yep.
After that, protecting this, because I had no idea how much resistance there would be within the organization about this little, they thought of it as your pet project. And of course, I'm coming in from the outside. I don't know anything about the culture. What I wanted to do was to have the whole thing act like a startup with the same amount of sense of urgency, quick decisions, and, and so forth, and, efficiently keep you in the loop. And the protection was absolutely essential. And I didn't realize it when I first got there.
Yeah. I think you see it at different degrees of intensity, but it's always there in any organization.
I'm going to change gears a little bit. I have a different type of question. So you're very proudly of Armenian descent.
Yes.
And that is a population that has been persecuted and subjected to genocide for millennia.
Mm-hmm.
And how much of that background has formed your personality?
Great question. Both my grandfathers were, by definition, survivors. If either one of them had not survived, I wouldn't be here. And I did not know my paternal grandfather. He passed away when I was 6 months old. He knew of me. I did not know of him. But I spent quite a bit of time with my maternal grandfather, who was 15 when the most recent and most prominent Armenian genocide was propagated during World War I by the Ottoman Empire. It was the defining moment of his life. Until the day he died, he was talking about it, writing about it. And part of what I have always felt because of that, was he survived, and you, Kaigham, have the privilege of not being persecuted, having enough to eat, a roof over your head. You have to make the world a better place. So that is a motivating force for me. When he was 15, he was running around in the upper reaches of what has now become Syrian mountainside, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, just surviving by just his own capabilities and foraging. And I'll tell you a funny story which obnoxed my dad and my mom. They would come and stay with us. And my grandfather, despite our comfort and living in suburban York, Pennsylvania, my grandfather taught me how to catch birds, like sparrows and small birds, with just a piece of thread. And we caught a couple of sparrows and he killed them. We cleaned them. My mom roasted them. He insisted that my mom roasted it. My dad flipped out. Because there we were, grandfather and grandson, capturing sparrows. All the neighbors could see us, but that's how much it affected him.
So you just pronounced your first name, or what he said, how he pronounced it, differently than I've heard it. So what's the correct pronunciation?
It's Kaigham. So the G and the H are like the R in Paris in the way a Frenchman would say it, right? They don't say Paris, they say Paris. It comes from the back of the throat. So the GH is like the R in Paris, pronounced in the French way.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
This may be a related question, and it's one of my favorite topics is to talk to people who have done startups, and you've done many startups. Okay. Acousticus, sort of the one anyone who knew about your background would say, oh, there's his startup.
Yep.
And he's sold it. ATAP was a startup. BioForge is a startup. And you've been involved with Dover in many different roles. And so all of that stuff and other things that you've done require a lot of grit. And so I want to ask where you think your grit comes from. Is it the same answer? Is it this grandfather?
Definitely grandfather. Definitely father as well. My father was a he was always intellectually curious, but he was a businessman through and through. He started his own business during both very difficult times in the old country, politically and all sorts of other things. I took inspiration from that. He was business minded, and I didn't realize how much of that influenced me. Initially, I thought, well, I'm going to go get a PhD. I'll be a professor. I'll have a life of intellectual examination, and quickly realized that that was not enough for me personally. So part of the grit is definitely, I'd say from my grandfather's, more survival. That's going to take a lot if you think you're going to take me out, right? Because that's what my grandfather taught me. My father taught me that it is noble to be, in the classic sense of business, that you're delivering a service that people want and makes their life better. He was an air conditioning engineer, so quite easy for him to understand that people wanted to live more comfortably. He was delivering a service so this isn't about ripping people off from like a Ponzi scheme, but a business in the classic capitalist perspective of delivering something that's a better product that makes people's lives better. That's what businesses are. They're not terrible. They employ people, they deliver service or products at a decent price. And if you have the right sort of free, regulated capitalism, that's the way it thrives. So I'd say the grit came from my grandfather, the skill or interest in business. And to the extent that I have any natural capabilities in that, whether it's forming a company, dealing with business partners, making deals, that's from my dad.
And my last question is going to be, so is all the funding and everything you need for BioForge safe from the insanity of this new administration?
Yeah. So thank you for raising that. Yes, in the sense that all of our funding is coming from the R.K. Mellon Foundation. It's $10 million a year for 10 years. It is safe in the sense from a direct perspective, right? So we don't get anything. We don't have any of our funding from the federal government by design. But a small digression, I'll come back to it. One of the things that people tend to lose sight of is how much $1 million is and how much you can get done. And some people might think, well, gee, Ken, you were deputy director or acting director of a $3 billion a year agency in the government. And you were president and CEO of Draper, 600 million plus in revenue, 2,000 people. You were COO of Wellcome, which was 200 million a year in research dollars going out to all over the world, 160 plus organization. And now it's like $10 million a year, $9 million a year budget. And $1 million is a hell of a lot of money. You can get a lot of really amazing stuff done. And it's actually in a counterintuitive way. You can actually get a lot more done if you're focused on a small team with $10 million than you can with 50 people on $100 million. Because it's the same reason why startups succeed, is because they're small, they're agile, and they're fast. And they don't have 1,000 things they're worrying about. They're just one or two things they're worrying. And so
They're willing to take risks.
And they're willing to take risks, right? What do I have to lose? And especially at this stage in my career, and in my life, my attitude is, I don't know if I ever told you this, but we got some Dugan and I when we were going in the first time, actually the only time. The second time for me, second time for her, but both of us going in as director and deputy director. There was a retired Army general 4-star that came to see us, and his advice, he wrapped it up at the end and he said, "Write it like you stole it."
Some of these people come up with great short
Yeah.
philosophies.
Don't just move out, do things, and write it like you stole it. And it's the best advice I ever got. And
That's got to be the title of this episode.
there you go. Yeah. And I think that's what motivates me about BioForge. I'm moving fast. The money doesn't do me any good in the bank. $10 million is a hell of a lot of money.
I agree. And it's, from what I'm observing, you're having the most fun I've seen you have.
Yeah, because it allows me to focus on the things that matter and to work with people and actually bring that same perspective to them and see them all saying, yeah, I could do that. You mean I don't have to submit a proposal to you on a fixed time frame for a project? I said, no, just come talk to me. And it's just blowing people away, just fundamentally changing the way they think about things. So the directly no, indirectly, obviously, if stock markets if the economy gets hammered, philanthropies have all their money in various financial instruments. The partners that I want to work with, I talked to you about their NIH-funded research and NSF-funded research at the universities here. The more the indirect and other things get cut, the less discretionary dollars they have to contribute. Because one of the things I absolutely require and demand as part of the model for BioForge is, if you want to do a project with me and we both agree this fits the mission and will help you and we'll get something important out, I expect you to put some skin in the game for the project. It's not going to be fully funded by BioForge, but in the new environment, I have to be willing to accommodate less skin in the game because they're beginning to lose that flexibility.
Well, this has been really fun.
Yes.
I think we're at a good stopping point, and I appreciate very much these conversations.
Wonderful. It's great. We haven't had a chance to talk about some of these things. I really appreciate it. It was great to step out of the usual day. Thanks, Jaffe.
That's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in. Today's takeaways about Ken Gabriel are: Ken articulates the mission of BioForge as creating innovations in the manufacturing of precision biological medicines. The emphasis on translating scientific research into practical capabilities for society underscores the importance of real-world applications of technology. Ken reflects on the significance of leadership and innovation, asserting that CEOs must actively protect and nurture breakthrough projects. The conversation highlights the distinction between basic research and mission-driven innovation, particularly in the context of DARPA's operational philosophy. Ken's personal narrative illustrates how his heritage and family history have instilled a sense of responsibility to contribute positively to the world. The show notes contain useful resources and links. Please follow and rate us at podchaser.com/designing successful startups. Also, please share and like us on your social media channels. This is Jaffe Rosenberg saying TTFN, ta-ta for now.